Well, thanks for coming, folks. And I presume there are a few of you out on Zoom land, and we'll try to make sure you're included as well. And let me know if there's any trouble in hearing me or what have you. And accustomed as I am to public speaking, as I began last week with saying. So here at the title slide, I just want to revamp and recall that last week we covered the early navigators who explored North America beginning in 1497 with John Cabot, and finished last week's talk with Humphrey Gilbert, who set out in 1583 to build an English colony in Norumbega. At that time, it was a native name that at that time covered the central area of coastal Maine and Penobscot Bay. Unfortunately, as Queen Elizabeth said, quote, "He was a man of no good hap with the sea." His flagship sank, and the small pinnace he was sailing back to England on was swallowed up by a large wave on his return. So that ended our talk last week. Sir Walter Raleigh. It is clear that Sir Humphrey Gilbert's death was a great loss for Queen Elizabeth. The next man to push for colonization of North America was Sir Humphrey Gilbert's younger half-brother, Sir Walter Raleigh. If anything, she was even closer to him than to Sir Humphrey. Immediately after his brother's death, Sir Walter sought and easily obtained in March of 1584 a patent from the Queen to explore and colonize North America. This patent contained essentially the same wording as the patent given to Gilbert. Raleigh, however, was intent on colonizing further south in what he, at this point, had named Virginia. This is the name that it was in honor of course, the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth. He was aware of coastal geography as explored initially by Verrazano 50 years before, and later subsequent explorations had improved the map considerably. Chesapeake Bay and Delaware Bay had been recognized and entered, and Raleigh was aware that the outer banks of North Carolina did not form a narrow waste of North America as Verrazano had believed. Pamlico Sound, inside the Outer Banks, was not the Pacific Ocean. Raleigh thought that this area might prove ideal for his colony. In 1584, he sent 2 vessels to reconnoiter the area. They arrived in July of that year at a point on the Outer Banks above Cape Fear, which is a little further down here, and they sailed north until they discovered an inlet north of Cape Hatteras, right here. On a nearby island was the village of the Roanoke tribe, who were Algonquin-speaking Indians. These people and their chief were very welcoming. The Explorer's Journal writes that, quote, "We found the people most gentle, loving and faithful, void of all guile and treason, and such as lived after the manner of the Golden Age," unquote. 2 of the chief's sons volunteered to return to England with them. This area became the site for Raleigh's first colony. Raleigh tried twice to colonize this area. He worked with Richard Hakluyt to sell the place. You remember last week I discussed the importance of Richard Hakluyt in the talk in terms of promoting colonization in particularly Maine, but all over North America. He wrote a discourse concerning Western planting to promote the colonization. Although the Queen was at first hesitant to allow the plan to go forward, she eventually knighted Raleigh and allowed him to change the name of the area to Virginia. The entire North American coast from Georgia to Maine was labeled Virginia. Raleigh himself could not go without upsetting the Queen, so he engaged a fellow gentleman from Devon, Sir Richard Grenville, who lives just outside of Plymouth, to be commander-in-chief. With the Queen's permission and a fleet of 7 ships, including 108 colonists, Grenville departed from Plymouth in April of 1585. Interestingly, Raleigh sent along with him an artist, John White, and a scientist, Thomas Harriot, to record and evaluate what they found. The lead ship was named Tiger. It had been donated by the Queen herself from her navy. The two sons of the Roanoke chief, who had been brought to England in 1584, were traveling home with this fleet. They sailed via the Caribbean, and the ships arrived at Cape Lookout on the North Carolina coastline in June of 1585. Over a period of about 2 months, Grenville explored the possibilities for a site for the colony. Eventually, the chief of the Roanoke tribe invited the colonists to settle their colony on Roanoke Island, an offer that the Englishmen joyfully accepted. The food stores, freight, the 108 colonists, and some cattle were offloaded, and Grenville and his ships left in late August of 1585. On their way home, Grenville succeeded in capturing a richly laden Spanish ship, bringing her to Plymouth. This and other prizes taken as they sailed through the Caribbean allowed for rich returns to the investors in this adventure. Meanwhile, things did not go well for the English colonists on Roanoke. Despite help from the local Indians in teaching them how to fish and gather food, their food supplies were inadequate, and the colonists were not successful learning how to do it for themselves. The Indians were soon resentful and hatched a plan to wipe out the bloody Englishmen. The English learned about this in advance, and in early June of 1586, 25 Englishmen attacked the Indian village, killed the chief of the Roanokes, and after that, the colonists expected a reprisal. However, as luck would have it, within a week, the Englishmen were saved by the unexpected arrival of Sir Francis Drake on his return to England from a tour of privateering in the Caribbean. Drake had planned to check on the colony on his way home. He ended up picking up all 103 surviving colonists. The colonists left behind many angry Indians, as you can imagine. John White's dry apologized for the poor quality of it, but you get the idea. John White's drawing of the natives were widely shown in England and much appreciated. Thomas Harriot, the scientist, reported on, among other things, the presence of sassafras, though it thought to be a cure for what they called then the French pox. Today we refer to it as syphilis. This was a product also sought by the Popham Colony. Remarkably, this experience did not prevent Sir Walter Raleigh from planning a second Virginia colony. This time he employed the artist John White to be the governor. The plan was to send the colony to a site somewhere just inside Chesapeake Bay on the south shore. Captain Ralph Lane had explored the area and told Raleigh that it was preferable because it had better ship access than the Roanoke Island. The plan was to found, quote, the city of Raleigh at that site. In order to start a self-perpetuating community, Raleigh arranged for the 117 colonists, which included 11 women and 17 children, all middle-class English people. Among them was John White's pregnant daughter, Eleanor Dare, and her husband. The fleet, consisting of the 110-ton ship Red Lion and a smaller flyboat and a pinnace, left Plymouth in May of 1587. The fleet commander was Simon Ferdinando, who had been on the previous 2 voyages to Virginia in the Outer Banks, and he was a difficult man. His major interest was privateering. Delivering the colonists was of less concern. On the way to their planned site on Chesapeake Bay, they stopped at Roanoke Island. While there, Ferdinando declared, quote, the summer was far spent, end of quote. He wanted to get on to the more lucrative activity of privateering, and he insisted that the colonists debark on July 25th on Roanoke Island instead of taking them to the planned destination further up the coast on Chesapeake Bay. Before he left, White's daughter, Eleanor, delivered Virginia Dare on August 18th, 1587. She was the first English person born in North America. Relations with the Indians were, of course, very uncertain. It was decided that the colony needed to have John White go back to England to best represent the city of Raleigh. So on August 27th, he left with the fleet for England. Once in the Azores, he took a flyboat back to England, and Captain Ferdinando headed off to seek Spanish prizes. What happened to the colonists who were left on Roanoke is unknown and a mystery that has never been solved. The best guess is that because of starvation, they joined with a local Indian tribe. Any return to Roanoke Island in 1588 to provide supplies was prevented by the attack on England of the Spanish Armada, for which all available ships were needed. It was not until August of 1590, 3 years later, that John White was able to visit the island. He found there no living souls. The fort and houses were overgrown, but there was no evidence of a massacre or destruction. Apparently, White had expected his 1587 colony might move from Roanoke Island, and he asked them to leave a carved message as to where they went. On a post near the fort, the word Croatoan had been carved. Croatoan was the name of another nearby island near Cape Hatteras. Where another Indian tribe lived. The captain of the relief ship was in such a hurry to head for prize taking in the Caribbean, he refused to stop and check at Croatoan Island. The Indians on that island left in 1650 and settled in central North Carolina. This ended the attempts of English colonization in Virginia during the 1500s. I have an idea that Queen Elizabeth felt that she had been burned one too many times by her ambitious West Country navigators. It was not until after she died in 1603 and her nephew, James VI of Scotland, had become king that the idea of English colonization of North America / Virginia was resurrected. Between 1602 and 1607, the year the Popham Colony was settled, mariners from the West Country undertook 4 exploratory voyages to North Virginia in preparation for the Popham Colony. The first voyager in 1602 was this man, Bartholomew Gosnold, who was born in 1571. He had attended Cambridge University and become a lawyer, and then attended the Middle Temple in London, where he was trained to become a barrister. Along the way, he was heavily influenced by Richard Hakluyt in learning the art of navigation and geography. His ambition was to sail to Norumbega and start a trading post. Gosnold was most specifically wanted to find the harbor that I mentioned last week, where Verrazano spent 2 weeks in 1524. We now know that place was Newport Harbor and Narragansett Bay. Gosnold had support and funding from the Earl of Southampton and the East India Company, again, to try to find a way through the Northwest Passage. He left Falmouth Harbor in Cornwall in April of 1602 with 32 men on the Concord, a small ship of 30 tons. His first landfall on May 14th of 1602 was north of the 40-degree latitude goal he had set for himself. It is now thought to have been Cape Small in Phippsburg, or perhaps Cape Nettic in York. After the Concord anchored, a sailing shallop with 8 Indians approached. They were not local Abenakis, but Micmacs from Nova Scotia. They had stolen a shallop which had been left over the winter by Basque fishermen. The Micmacs had learned how to sail these vessels and used them for trading with other Indians along the coast. From Maine, Gosnold sailed west around the arm of land that he named Cape Cod. I should have really said south, I suppose, but it was west and south. They continued south, finding a beautiful island that Gosnold named Martha's Vineyard, after his young daughter, who had recently died. To the west of Martha's Vineyard, they came upon an archipelago of small islands, and they called these the Elizabeth Islands, after Gosnold's sister. On one of these islands, probably Cutty Hunk, they built a small trading post and began trading with friendly, presumably Wampanoag Indians. They also collected sassafras, which would command a good price back in England. Gosnold left the men on Cuttyhunk and tried to find the Narragansett Bay, which he thought might be passage to India, but he missed the bay and only explored Buzzards Bay. Upon returning, he learned that his men had angered the local Indians by stealing one of their canoes. His men feared an Indian attack, so none were willing to stay at the fort and trading post that they had built and planned to do. Concord weighed anchor in June and arrived back in England in July of 1602. I think it's interesting to note here that in 1607, Gosnold captained the Godspeed. This is a replica of the Godspeed, one of 3 ships sent to the original colonists to Jamestown to be with the original colonists. He was described by Captain John Smith as a, quote, prime mover in the founding of the Jamestown colony. Unfortunately, Gosnold died in 1607 in Jamestown at the age of 36 during that first very difficult year. In 1602, archaeologists found his grave and the skeleton just outside the Jamestown fort. His bones are now on display at the Archaearium Museum in Jamestown. And this is a picture I took when I was there a couple of years ago. Pardon me? Yeah, pretty complete. And they're an interesting, I didn't want to lengthen things, but the story of how they figured that this was Gosnold was quite interesting. So the next explorer in 1603, Richard Hakluyt, and businessman from Bristol, England, sent 2 ships under the command of Captain Martin Pring to further explore and evaluate the New England coast. In April of 1603, 2 ships, the Speedwell and the Discoverer, with about 45 men and boys, left Bristol just after learning about the death of Queen Elizabeth. Their plan was to visit the coast of North Virginia to obtain furs and sassafras. Their landfall was Penobscot Bay, near Vinyl Haven. They explored the coast from there down to Cape Elizabeth, but found no sassafras. So they continued further south and anchored in Provincetown Harbor. There they found plenty of sassafras and set up a camp surrounded by a fence and ditch, similar to the fence and ditch or trench and ditch set up that the Popham Colony put together a couple of years later that we'll describe. He had good relationships with the Indians and obtained furs. They also planted seeds of various wheat, barley, etc., which sprouted and grew during the 7 weeks that they stayed there. This showed that the soil and the climate was favorable for locating a colony in New England. Interestingly, one of the young men in the group played a guitar, and the Indians loved to circle around him and dance to his tunes. Thought that was fun. Sir Ferdinando Gorges, sounds like a Spaniard, but he was an Englishman from Plymouth. In fact, the steam ferry that used to go across from here to Woolwich was the Ferdinando Gorges back 100 years ago. He was the governor of the Plymouth Fort, which guarded Plymouth Harbor and was one of the busiest ports of England. He was related to both the Raleigh and the Gilbert families. And as a member of the Plymouth group, Gorges had become a major supporter of English settlement in North Virginia. And later, he was a critical person in the support of the Popham Colony. His enthusiasm for Maine continued well into the 1600s. In 1622, he received a land patent for the province of Maine from the Plymouth Council for New England, with boundaries extending from the Merrimack River to the Kennebec River and 60 miles inland. So he loved Maine, but he never got here. In 1605, the very significant voyage of Captain George Weymouth was carried out. This voyage has been said to mark, quote, the earliest known English claim to the right of possession on the New England coast, end of quote. Weymouth set out a wooden cross on Allen Island in Muscongas Bay to visibly stake this claim. Weymouth's father had been a shipbuilder in Devon with enough success to have provided financial support for Sir Humphrey Gilbert's unsuccessful attempt in 1583. In 1601, George Weymouth had been in command of a ship sent by the East India Company of London to explore the coast of Labrador, again looking for the northwest passage. And of course he didn't find that, but he did locate the entrance to the Hudson Strait. So in 1605, Sir Ferdinando Gorges and a group of Plymouth merchants hired Weymouth to explore the coast of North Virginia. Again, this is just 2 years before the Popham Colony was settled. Weymouth left Dartmouth in Devon on Easter Sunday, March 31st, 1605, as captain of the Archangel, a ship manned by a crew of 29. They traveled by the usual route via the Azores and arrived at Monhegan Island on May 18th. Oops, I didn't mean that. So here's Monhegan. After a brief visit there, they proceeded to Allen Island, right here, which is part of a group of islands located in Muscungus Bay. You know, this is Muscungus Bay from Port Clyde over to Pemmican Point, basically, near the mouth of the St. George River, right here. In 1979, Allen Island and Benner Island were purchased by the Andrew Wyeth family, and they are now owned by Colby College. The harbor between Allen, Benner, Davis, and Burnt, right here, was named George's Harbor, and it forms a very well-protected anchorage. His ship stayed there for about a month, and they left a wooden cross on Allen Island. During those weeks, they made a careful exploration of the area. James Rozier served as the recorder, and he became the chief propagandist for the settlement in this area. This is a photo of the entrance into George's Harbor between Allen and Benner that I actually took a couple of years ago on a trip in that area. Contact with the Indians was at first very pleasant. The Indians, presumably Abenakis from a village on the Pemmican Peninsula, had not much prior exposure to Europeans. Many gifts were exchanged and trade made. Rozier writes that the Indians, quote, all seemed very civil and merry. We found them a people of exceeding good invention, quick understanding, and ready capacity, unquote. He really liked them, he says. One interesting story was that Weymouth magnetized his sword using a lodestone, which was a device for magnetizing the needle in a compass, and they needed to have one of those on board a ship. So when his sword was magnetized, he was then able to point to a knife and get it to move without touching it. And this really had the Indians amazed. You know, they looked at that as great fun. Weymouth and his crew explored the nearby St. George River, traveling up to where the town of Thomaston is today. Then with a shallop, they continued up the more narrow part of the river to where the town of Warren is. Later, wearing their full armor and helmets, a group of 10 men hiked 4 miles east from Thomaston toward Rockland before turning back to their boat. They probably made it as far as the site where the cement quarry is today, along Route 1. They saw the Camden Hills and noted them, but they did not see Penobscot Bay. Due to the June heat, oops, what did I do here? Due to the June heat, they were exhausted by this hike. It must have been made quite a sight, marching along, sweating in their armor. They left another wooden cross near the site of Thomaston. In addition to gathering information about the area for a permanent colony, Weymouth's men carried out a plan to abduct Abenaki men so they could learn about the geography of the area and about the Indians' culture and language. They succeeded in capturing 5 men and brought them back to England. One of the men was Nahananda, chief of the Pemmican village. In England, these men were lodged, 2 of them with Sir John Popham, and 3 of them with Sir Ferdinando Gorges. Both Popham and Gorges were deeply influenced by these representatives of the Abenaki people. They found them to be intelligent and thoughtful human beings. This led Popham and Gorges to increase their already strong support for establishing the Popham Colony. 4 of the 5 Indian men were soon returned to their people. However, the terrible impression left with the Abenakis, who initially thought that the men had been murdered, impaired future trade possibilities and cooperation with the Indians as far as the Popham Colony was concerned. So as soon as he gets back, Rozier writes this book, quote, "A true relation of the most prosperous voyage made in this present year, 1605, by Captain George Weymouth in the discovery of the land of Virginia." And there's the book that was published in London in 1605. It provided valuable information on the natural history and geography of coastal Maine in the vicinity of the St. George River. Rozier also described and praised the inhabitants, the Abenaki Indians, and wrote a vocabulary of several hundred words that they used. His writing was an attempt to encourage settlement in the area, and he exaggerated at times. For example, he described the St. George River as extending at least 40 miles inland. And in fact, the river itself goes about 10 miles up to Thomaston. Rozier also wrote glowingly about the plentiful sweet fish and lobsters, hoping to stimulate a fishing industry off the coast of Maine. On the 16th of June, the Discovery weighed anchor and sailed home with 5, quote, savages, unquote, 2 canoes, and an assortment of bows and arrows. They arrived back at Dartmouth in July of 1605. The name Maine for this area perhaps originated at this time. Rozier's written descriptions referring to looking from the sea and the islands up into the main, and the main, by which he means mainland, but he spelled it M-A-I-N-E, looking into the main. And I've since talked to others about this, and that's probably where the word Maine came from, as opposed to using the province of Maine, which is spelled that way in France. In 1606, Richard Hakluyt, Sir John Popham, and others petitioned King James for a patent to colonize Virginia. A new joint stock company was formed, the Virginia Company. It was organized with 2 branches, one, a London Company, which was to colonize in the south of Virginia, or in South Virginia, as they said it, and the other branch, the Plymouth Colony, was to colonize in North Virginia. It was the Plymouth branch, including Sir John Popham, that organized and financed the Popham Colony. The South Virginia colony, which became Jamestown, was to settle between latitudes 34 and 41. And the North Virginia colony, founded by the Plymouth branch, was to settle between 38 and 45 degrees. They didn't specify beyond that in this document. The overlap was intentional and meant to allow the more successful colony to claim the land in between. The Plymouth Company's major financial support came from Sir John Popham, who maintained a home in the western county of Somerset. He was Lord Chief Justice of the Queen's Court, and he was the wealthiest lawyer in England. He was a very powerful and influential man. Sir, so the question is, in his right hand, are those gloves or sassafras? It's gloves. I don't think he had a problem at that point that he needed the sassafras for. But I might be wrong. He was quite a devil, and I won't go into that. But it's an interesting story of his life, actually. Sir Popham was a member of the Middle Temple in London, one of the Inns of Court that trained lawyers to work as barristers before the royal courts. Barristers were the only lawyers who could argue in court before judges. There were 4 Inns of Court in England, all of them in London. Much of the support for creating the Virginia Company and settling colonies in North America, North Virginia, Popham, and South Virginia, Jamestown, came from men who belonged to the Middle Temple. The Temple Hall shown here was built in 1570. And I was there a couple of months ago, and there's my wife and niece. We're about to go in and have lunch. But it's a wonderful place in London if you ever get a chance. The dining room of the Middle Temple serves luncheon daily, as it did in this medieval hall, probably as it has been for 400 or 500 years now. William Shakespeare presented the first performance of Twelfth Night here in 1602, and Queen Elizabeth was a frequent visitor. This is outside the hall. You can see the walls of the hall on the left. The temple gardens with the Thames River in the distance are beautiful. And you wouldn't figure, but that's the Thames River right there. It's the embankment. And right across the river from there is the Globe Theater. So it's a kind of a central location in London. And I urge you all to go there next time you're in London. These are barristers leaving the Middle Temple, heading for court, which is across the street from the Middle Temple. And these are two plaques on the walls of the dining area of the hall, describing that many members of the time were involved in the colonization of the Popham and Jamestown colonies. This plaque states that Sir John Popham had been treasurer of the Middle Temple from 1580 to 1588 and was a driving force in the establishment of the Virginia Company. It also states that Sir Thomas Hannum, who we haven't described yet, but is coming up, had explored the coast of Maine in preparation for the Popham Colony. It did this exploration in 1606. Notice also Bartholomew Gosnold's name as a member of the Middle Temple. The second plaque says the Middle Templars made a major contribution to the early exploration and colonization of North America. So I'm not reading the whole thing, but it's a lot of fun and amazing to see this right there in the center of London, in the medieval center of London. Even Sir Walter Raleigh is mentioned as a member. Within the dining area, the dining hall, is a ceremonial table, which is they keep covered most of the time, but the guys lifted it up so I could take a photo of it. This table is where, when people become new members, they sign in, and it's a kind of a important place to sign. But the table was made from the hatch of Sir Francis Drake's flagship, the Golden Hind, which had sailed around the world between 1577 and 1588. And he was also a member of the Middle Temple. It's amazing. So in preparation for settlement in North Virginia, in 1606, 2 ships were sent back to the coast of Maine in order to make a final decision about where the location for the colony should be. The first ship sent was the Richard, and it had with them 2 of the captive Indians, bringing them back to Maine. However, the ship was unfortunately captured by the Spanish as it sailed south toward the Azores. Might have gone a little too far by mistake. And the ship was destroyed. One of the Indians was killed, but the other got away and eventually got back to England and back to Pembroke. So that was a good story. The second ship, under the command of Captain Thomas Hannum, with Martin Pring as navigator, left a month later. They had on board another Indian, Nahanada, who had been the chief of the Pemaquid village. When they arrived at George's Harbor and did not find the Richard, they returned Nanahanda and explored the coastline. They visited the mouth of the Sagadahoc, now called the Kennebec River, and with Nanahanda's advice, concluded that that site was the best site for the future colony. Much of the story of the actual settlement of the Popham Colony has been lost. Journals and letters were discarded and lost over the years. The most complete story that we have is that told in the journal of Captain Robert Davies, who was the pilot, not the captain, of the Marian John, one of the 2 ships that came over in 1607. He was also the commander of the Mary and John when it returned from the Popham Colony in the fall of 1607. Davies' grammar and spelling make it for an interesting visit into the language of Elizabethan England. But my quotes will here be in modern English, but it was a lot of fun to try to read how these people spoke and spelled, and syntax and grammar was very different from us. But I think if you were there with them, you know, and understand most of what they were saying. The Lord Chief Justice, Sir John Popham's vigorous and enthusiastic support for the colonial enterprise, he gave £500 a year to be continued for 5 years. So that was quite a deal. Along with Sir Ferdinando Gorges' steady ongoing support, the decision was made to colonize at the mouth of the Sagadahoc River. The goal of the colonies were, 1, to claim possession of the land of North Virginia for England. 2, to make money, obtaining valuable materials, perhaps even gold. They had a guy who could find gold if there was around there. To build a pinnace and use it to find out if any of the local rivers were connected to the Pacific Ocean, as well as for other trade purposes. And this is according to an author that I've read, to establish the Protestant religion amongst the heathens. So on May 31st, 1607, Mary and John, a ship of 180 tons, and the smaller flyboat, the Gift of God, left Plymouth for Sagadahoc. The Mary and John was commanded by Raleigh Gilbert, 27-year-old son of Sir Humphrey Gilbert, the guy that was swallowed up by the waves 25 years before. And he was also the nephew of Sir Walter Raleigh. Ferdinando Gorges later described Raleigh Gilbert as headstrong and lacking in good sense. He had been named admiral of the colony. The Gift of God was commanded by George Popham, a nephew of Sir John Popham. He was named president of the new colony. I think he was slightly over the admiral. George Popham was an older man, probably in his 50s, who seemed to have been a wise and more prudent individual. Gorges describes him as, quote, an honest man, but old, and of unwieldy body and timorously fearful to offend, close quote. The ship sailed by the usual first passage down to the Azores. Plymouth down to the things are missing on either side of the slide. I apologize. That's kind of my fault. But so they get down to the Azores, and they anchored to get more water and wood, which ships needed in those days to continue these voyages. The Gift of God was anchored to the windward of the Mary and John, and then the air being calm, they could not reach each other after anchoring. That same day, a ship from the Netherlands, which at that time was at war with Spain, arrived and anchored right close to the Mary and John. The Dutch ship would have been suspicious of any foreign ships it encountered, and its captain came over in a boat. One of the crewmen on the Mary and John recognized him, having sailed with the Dutch captain before, and vouched for him. So the Dutch captain was welcomed aboard, and the two captains shared a can of beer. It seems beer in those days was already being stored in cans. Following this, Raleigh Gilbert was obliged to visit the Dutch ship. He brought several, quote, gentlemen along with him, and once aboard the Dutch ship, the Englishmen were restrained for 10 hours, accused of being pirates. They were threatened with being thrown overboard and with the Mary and John being taken captive. Only after convincing the Dutch that their commission was valid was Gilbert and his men released. As night fell, the Gift of God took off ahead of the Mary and John, and the two ships sailed separately across the Atlantic Ocean. On the 27th of July, Mary and John passed over the banks off Sable Island and anchored off the southwest coast of Nova Scotia. Here they encountered a shallop, again manned by Micmac Indians who were anxious to trade. They noted that the Indians used French words. They took on water at this site, and from there they crossed the Bay of Fundy toward Penobscot Bay. By August 7th, they were safely anchored in George's Harbor. They noted that the wooden cross that had been set up by Weymouth on island 2 years before was still standing. Later that day, they joyfully noted the arrival of the gift of God into the harbor. That night, Captain Gilbert, with 14 men, used the ship's boat to take Skidwara. He was one of the captured Indians that was returning to Maine, to Pemaquid, back to the village. And they did this at night. They rowed across from George's Harbor over to New Harbor, and then they walked 3 miles across the peninsula to the Pemaquid Indian camp, arriving in the dark of night. When they got there, they found 100 men, women, and children, along with the chief, Nanahanda, who had returned from England the prior year with Captain Hannum. This visit was poorly handled by Gilbert. It frightened and intimidated the Indians. You know, Indians knew they had guns and could slaughter people if they so chose. So Skidwara returned to the ship with them that time, but after a subsequent visit to the village, he refused to return to the ship. This was a significant loss for the Popham Colony, who had hoped he would stay with them and facilitate their trade with local Indians. This is meant to be the mouth of the Kennebec River, and you can see Small Point and Bay Point and Popham Beach here, and Seguin Island. On August 12th, the two ships weighed anchor out of George's Harbor and went west toward the mouth of the Kennebec River. Apparently, the chart for finding and recognizing Seguin Island was on the gift of God. Seguin is an Indian name given the island about 2 miles off the mouth of the Kennebec River. The two ships became separated, and the pilot of the Marion John did not recognize Seguin Island. As a result, the gift of God turned into the river properly, but the Marion John missed the turn and became becalmed off Cape Small. That night, you see, they miss it and they're sort of becalmed in here. That night, a gale developed with an onshore wind, and the Marion John came very near to crashing on the rocks of Sewell Beach and Popham Beach. But luckily, they did not. And eventually, when the wind calmed in the morning, George Popham set out a shallop and, with the Marion John's boat, towed the becalmed ship into the anchorage, the initial anchorage right inside the river here. Sort of, this is Honeywell Point where the fort is today. At this point, the actual site of the fort and colony had not yet been chosen. On August 17th, Captain Popham and his shallop and Captain Gilbert in his ship's boat sailed up the Kennebec River to evaluate the river for an optimal site for the fort. It is thought they got about as far as Merrymeeting Bay, spent the night there, and then returned to the ships the next afternoon. Once they returned, they decided that they would build the colony on the west side of the river near the mouth, because, as this journal of Davies says, quote, it being almost an island of good bigness. And I don't know whether you've ever recognized, it's hard to tell you here, but here's the island. This is all marshy. And when you drive through there to Popham Beach, you're really driving on a causeway. So it really is almost an island. Of some importance, too, was the recognition that the site, which today is called Sabino Point, is not visible from just outside the river. This provided a measure of protection from possible attack by French or Spanish ships if they happened to come by. On the 19th of August, pretty late in the season, they all went ashore at the site of their future plantation, listened to a sermon by the minister, and then were read aloud too the patent with its orders and laws. And the next day, August 20th, 1607, George Popham dug the first spade of dirt to begin the building of the Fort St. George and the storehouse. Quoting Captain Richard Davies' journal, quote, all hands labored hard about the fort, some in the trench, some for the faggots. Faggots are bunches of branches and bushes that they tie together and they make up like kind of a fence that they would put I don't know, it was outside or inside the trench, but that was how they were protecting themselves. So to keep on with this quote, all hands labored hard about the fort, some in the trenches, some for faggots, and our ship carpenters about the building of a small pinnace. While most of the hands labored hard about the fort, the carpenters building a small pinnace, the president, George Popham, overseeing and applying everyone to his work. He was out there cheerleading everybody. Captain Gilbert set out with the shallop and some men to explore the coastline to the west. He got as far as Cape Elizabeth and observed the many islands of Casco Bay and was very impressed by seeing all this. In early September, 9 canoes and 40 Indians, men, women, and children from the Pemaquid village visited the colony, Nahananda and Skidware among them. They shared food and left after a few hours. The Indians offered to accompany the Englishmen to the Penobscot River to visit the chief of all chiefs, Bashaba. A few days later, Gilbert left with the hopes of a major trading mission with Bashaba, but poor winds slowed his sailing, and when he arrived at the Pemaquid River, the Indians had already left. Gilbert tried on his own to find the Penobscot River, but failed. An important opportunity to trade with the Abenakis was lost. I wonder if this chief of the chiefs, Bahaba's village on the Penobscot, had anything to do with the origin of the Norumbega myth, which I talked about last week, but it was presumably a big place. In late September, Gilbert, with 19 men, sailed up the Sagadahoc River, probably or the Kennebec River, getting above Augusta. They met an Indian chief named Sabino, who claimed he was the lord of the Sagadahoc River. On their return, they were advised to look for a river that was called Sassanoa by the natives, but the Englishmen could not see it. To me, it's understandable, but some of you can look out and see the entrance right over there, just beyond the bridge, and it isn't the most obvious turnoff when you're coming down. Gilbert's behavior with natives was also often insulting, and this was an important reason for the eventual failure of the colony. George Popham was much more aware of the need to treat Indians well. In early October, Nahandanda and his wife and Skidwares showed up again at Fort St. George. They shared a meal and spent the night. And the next day, being Sunday, the Indians attended church services, quote, with great reverence and silence, according to Davies. Wasn't that something? So there was still some attempt to be friendly. Shortly thereafter, George Popham decided to send the Mary and John back to England to report to Lord Popham, Ferdinando Gorges, and others as to the progress of the colony. This report included a carefully drawn plan of the fort drawn by John Hunt on October 8, 1607. This plan was obviously not meant to be the actual picture of the fort at that time. Captain Robert Davies, the author of the journal that provides us with the details related above, was commander of the Mary and John on its return voyage. 48 men returned on the Mary and John with him to England at this time because of a concern about lack of food. So I don't think I mentioned, but I think the original number of colonists was 104, men and boys. I know of one at least 14-year-old boy that was part of that group. Wonderful story that I won't tell this time, but it's a good story. But half of them basically didn't stay through the winter. Davies' descriptions of the Popham Colony stopped at this time. No other journal exists to tell us more of what happened at Fort St. George during the winter of 1607-08. We do know that the winter of 1607-08 was very cold in the Northern Hemisphere. That year, the Thames River froze over, which was a rare event. The colonists endured an extremely cold winter. Nothing of I hit this thing by mistake sometimes. Nothing of value was returned to England, and Ferdinando Gorges, a major investor, was disappointed. In his subsequent writing, he was highly critical of the colonists. Sir John Popham actually died in June of 1607, shortly after the Popham Colony ships had left England, but the colonists were not aware of this in 1607. In March of 1608, Ferdinando Gorges arranged for two. By that time, the Mary and John and the gift of God had arrived and told them how bad things were going. So he really hot-footed to get these two small ships over there for the summer. We know very little of what took place at Fort St. George during the winter and spring of 1608. Raleigh Gilbert's journal, which might have told us, has been lost. Sir George Popham died of unknown causes in February, and he was the only person to have died of the whole group. We don't know of what. So Raleigh Gilbert assumed leadership of the colony, and that, of course, wasn't such a great idea either. His personality was not well suited to be in charge. Presumably, the ships dispatched by Gorges arrived in late May or early June and brought word that Sir Popham had died. No record exists of their return, these ships' return, or if they brought back any cargo of value. Mary and John left Plymouth for Maine in July of 1608 and would not have arrived there until late August or early September. The Mary and John brought word that Raleigh Gilbert's brother John had died and left all the family estate to Raleigh. He felt obliged to return and claim it. With relatively poor relations with the Indians and thus minimal furs from trading, with no valuable minerals having been found, and the possibility of another cold winter ahead, food in short supply, the rest of the about 50 men felt there was no reason to stay. So they loaded up the Mary and John, and they had finished the pinnace, the Virginia, and on those two ships headed back to Plymouth, arriving there in November of 1608. Although the Popham Colony was ultimately a failure, the efforts leading up to the settlement and the experiences suffered by the Popham colonists resulted in important knowledge that helped Englishmen successfully colonize North America in the decades that followed. The next colony in New England was that of the Pilgrim Colony in 1620, who successfully settled New Plymouth on Massachusetts Bay. Much of that success is attributed to their beneficial relationship with the local indigenous people. They appreciated them, they could speak their language a little bit. The Popham Colony was an important stepping stone in the introduction of English culture and political philosophy into the United States. It deserves to be acknowledged and remembered as such.